אוי.
אוקיי. So, בוקר טוב אחר כך. בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, חנוכה שמח, חודש טוב, ברוך השם, there are many blessings to count today. And we are continuing our learning about and form of Shlomo Goren, which I picked up as a topic for last week and this week because of his connection to the Hashmonaim, to the Maccabim, to Hanukkah. And we finished last week in 1948. That's, of course, Milchemet HaAtzmaut, the Independence War. And Rav Goren is being asked to become the chief rabbi for the new nascent IDF. And first to begin to understand why was it that Rabbanut Tzva'it was even established? Why do we need a Rabbanut Tzva'it? We can have, Datiim, they would take care of themselves. There was a very specific event in Chativat Alexandroni. This was a Chativa. There were two cooks there, Tabachim, that were asked to cook on Shabbat for what at least they thought was not a necessary situation that enables one, that allows one to cook on Shabbat. So they refused. They refused, so they were thrown to jail, to the army jail, by their commander. As was the minhag back then, that was taken from the British army. So if you are thrown into jail, they shave your hair, your head hair. So that's another isur deoraita to completely shave one hair, including the piot. So that was, and then there was a big scandal over that. A, that they were even jailed for refusing to cook on Shabbat, and B, that they were forcibly shaved on their entrance to the jail. And the Rabbanim Rashim, the chief rabbis, Rav Uziel and Rav Herzog, went to Ben Gurion and they told him, if you want the team to be able to serve in your army, you must have rabbis in the army that would be able to protect the T soldiers. And Ben Gurion accepted that. And the Rabbanim Rashim who knew Rav Goren, if you remember, he wrote this special book when he was 16. And he got haskama from Rav Kook. So he was known as a young, brilliant man. And he was in the Hagana and in the Lechi. So he was also, obviously, he was a Zionist and he was connected. So they chose him as someone that would be able to be the Rav Rashi for Tzahal, though he was very young. And they called him and they asked him if he would take the position. And he refused. Said, I want to be a warrior. I was not recruited to the new army in order to become a Rav. That's not what I am looking to do. And also, if you remember, his father was also a Talmid Chacham, but he didn't want to work as a rabbi. So his son, Rav Shlomo, also got it from his father, and he said, I am not interested in being a rabbi. They asked him to meet with none other than Ben Gurion himself. He met with Ben Gurion, and Ben Gurion told him, there are two types of people who want the Datiim to have specific units. One is the Datiim, because they said if we would have our own units, we'd be able to keep kashrut, to keep Shabbat, etc. And also the Chilonim. Why? Because then the Datiim would not intervene in their kitchen and in their Shabbat requirements. So everyone was happy with specific units, designated units for religious people. However, said Ben Gurion, I am not happy with that because I think Ben Gurion had this ideal of mamlachtiyut, of the kingdom, that we need to have a general army, so people should be all together. And Ben Gurion had this idea. And he said, I don't want the religious to have their own army units. I want everyone to be together so we would be able to create one state. I don't want to have Lechi and Hagana and Etzel anymore. I want to have IDF. I want to have one army because if we have a united state, we need a united army. And Ben Gurion said, I think that you agree with me. And Rav Goren was also on the same page. He also thought that it would be better to have one army. But he said to Ben Gurion, I want to have one army, but for that, you needed the whole army would keep kashrut and keep Shabbat and keep the halacha. At least would enable everyone who is interested in that to be able to keep the halakha. And Ben-Gurion said, I am willing to do that, but I need someone to be in charge. Would you be in charge? Now, when it was put that way, then the young Rav Shlomo Goren understood that it is a unique opportunity to be able to do something, to put an impression on the way that the Medinat Israel would develop, which he had done. He indeed was successful in doing. He really shaped the Rabbanut Tzva'it, and by that shaped the whole of Tzahal. Now, obviously, there are countless of topics that he was involved in. I want here only to mention three of them, which I think are the three main ones. One is the whole question of Shabbat, Chag, and Yom Kippur. Yamim Tovim, the holidays. We began to speak about it last week because they wanted to make this connection with the Hashmonaim, because Rav Goren himself, when he was writing the fundamental tshuva about waging war on Shabbat, he said, we have a problem. For the last 2,000 years, there was no Jewish army. So no one dealt with these questions. All we have is some small remnants of halachot, some camps, we may say, camels, that remained from the time of the Hashmonaim. And he is learning halacha from the Hashmonaim. He's even using his history books about the Hashmonaim in order to be able to, because he needs to extract as much as he can, because there is so little. There is so much that was written on Shabbat, but so little that was written on Shabbat in the army. So he's plowing his way in this new field, and he's learning from the Hashmonaim, and he demonstrates how the Hashmonaim had a historical chidush, novelty, you may say. And that is that they understood that if you would only defend yourself on Shabbat, as it seems that there was the halacha that you are allowed to defend yourself in order to save life, but you are you're not allowed to go on an offensive on Shabbat. Rav Goren said that the Hashmonaim had this new idea that sometimes even going on the offense is part of the mitzvah of Milchama and is allowed on Shabbat. And he even came to the extent that he said that Shabbat is not the hater to wage war on Shabbat is not based on the old halachot of Pikuach Nefesh, but it is a specific allowance that is derived from different words. It is derived from the words להילחם בעיר עד רידתה. So you are allowed to fight, wage war against a city until you conquer it. עד רידתה. And that is a separate allowance that is more wide than the usual basis of Pikuach Nefesh. That is what Rav Goren had understood from the wars of the Hashmonaim. Now that itself, that's a very contest, as you can imagine, concept, and some agreed with it, some disagreed with it, but Rav Goren built the Rabbanut Tzva'it, and the way that the Rabbanut Tzva'it is approaching the question of Chilul Shabbat in army situations, so he built it upon this chidush that at least during war, I'm not speaking here obviously about training, but we speak about war, that you have this very wide permission to wage war on Shabbat. Now, another very interesting, again, so that was Shabbat, that was Yamim Tovim. On Yom Kippur, the first Yom Kippur, after the establishment of the IDF and the Rabbanut Tzva'it, Rav Goren sent a letter in which he said that the warriors which are engaged in actual fighting are allowed and even must drink and eat on Yom Kippur. The soldiers that are on second line, they should fast to the extent that they are able. That was his psika. And again, he learned it from the Hashmonaim. It's a very interesting Gemara that he used. You can see it here. In source bet. So this is a Gemara from Masechet Sota. Okay, a Gemara from Masechet Sota, source bet. Yochanan Kohen Gadol שמע בת קול מבית קודש הקודשים. So he heard, Yochanan Kohen Gadol heard a voice coming out from the Kodesh HaKodeshim, of the Holy of Holies, on Bet HaMikdash, in Bet HaMikdash, שהוא אומר, so the voice said, ניצחו טליה, the young men, the young kids, were victory, דאזו להגך קרבה לאנטיוכה, that went to make war in Turkey, in Antiocha. Rashi says, explains, ניצחו טליה דאזו להגך קרבה באנטיוכה. So he explains the historical context. Says Rashi, הלכו פרחי כהונה בני בית חשמונאי, so the young Kohanim of בית חשמונאי, להילחם עם יוונים, they went to make war with the Greeks, לפני יום הכיפורים, ונלחמו ביום הכיפורים. So they were fighting during יום כיפור, ושמע יוחנן בת קול, כשהיה עובד עבודת יום הכיפורים. So he heard the voice from the Holy of Holies. There is only one day a year that the Kohen Gadol enter into Kodesh HaKodashim, and that is Yom Kippur. So if Yochanan Kohen Gadol heard the voice in Kodesh HaKodashim, that means that it was on Yom Kippur, and there was a victory on Yom Kippur, a military victory of the Hashmonaim that went to wage war in Yom Kippurim. And from there, from this Gemara, Rav Goren extracted the halacha that even on Yom Kippurim, if you need, on war, you are allowed to wage war. Obviously, if you want to wage war, you need that the warriors would be strong, so you would need to eat, and you would need to make melacha, and everything needed for the sake of the war. That, again, that's another halacha that Rav Goren linked directly to the Hashmona, from the Hashmonaim, 2,000 years, 2,300 years to our own times. I think that's I find it very moving and very interesting. Another and very sad that we are still, the word is the same word. That is right. Another, but by the way, in the tshuva that he writes about Yom Kippur, he says just as the Hashmonaim were victorious on Yom Kippur, he said on that Yom Kippur of the first Yom Kippur of Medinat Israel, that he gave the psak that the soldiers are allowed to eat. He said, we won on all the fronts that we are fighting in at that Yom Kippur. Very interesting. Another topic that he was extremely involved in was the whole question of agunot. Now, to understand what the problem for agunot is, these are women that their husbands got missing in action. And on Yom HaAtzmaut, we had more than 1,000 men that were killed beyond enemy lines, and their bodies were not, they were not able, their fellow soldiers were not able to retrieve the bodies in the combat. So the bodies remained beyond enemy lines, more than 1,000. That's a huge number. Now, most of them were young people that were unmarried yet, which is a tragedy by itself, but there was no woman that remained unknowing what happened to her husband. But a few hundreds of them were married, and they left behind a woman. And if you don't have a body and you don't have a clear testimony what happened, then you are stuck. So in the beginning, the Gemara says that in the time of David HaMelech, every married soldier before going out to war would give a divorce bill to his wife. So if he gets chas v'chalila stranded and they don't know about missing in action, then they can activate the get. However, Rav Goren said we were not able to act on these lines. He tried to, but there were two main problems. One problem was that in their times, when a soldier would get out to war, he would only return home after the war is finished. But in our times, the soldiers get vacations. And on each vacation, because he spends with his wife, then you need a new get. The get cannot work after the husband has been with his wife. So there would be an endless line of getting that you have to write. And so it's something that is just unmanageable. The second problem, he said, was a moralic problem. Soldiers felt very at unease to write getting to their wives before the war. And he said the only way to make them do that was by a command that the army would command everyone to write a get, but then you have a problem of a forced get. You are not allowed to force someone into writing a get. And he said there was a great opposition. Almost no one wanted to write. People felt that it's I don't know, it's bad luck or whatever, and people didn't want to write. Just as a side note, when we went now to the last war in Gaza, then before the war, one of the soldiers approached me and asked me if I can help him in writing such a get for his wife. And we created a video. We spoke with the Rab Tzvai that was there. The Rabbanut still carry the same Gittin, or it's not specifically, it's not exactly Gittin, it's a permission to give a get. It's called the Minui Shlichut. So they still carry the forms. So if someone wants, then you can sign on such a form. So I sat on the Beidin that for this specific guy, but most of the soldiers are not interested. So the army stopped suggesting them. Okay, so they did it already on 1948. So they stopped suggesting them. So now what? Now what? And you have people that got missing and they have wives. So Rav Goren dedicated himself to go beyond enemy lines and find the missing bodies and retrieve them. He brought back himself hundreds and hundreds of our dead soldiers. Just a few examples. The same Chativa of Alexandroni we spoke about. So these two cooks were later put back into the fighting soldiers, but then there was more or less a religious pluga, a company, a religious company, and they were sent, it was the second day of Hanukkah, they were sent near Kiryat Gat, it was called Kisfalujah. There was some of the Egyptian army that IDF was not able back yet to drive away to the end of the war. Only the agreements at the end of the war, it was agreed that they would withdraw. But they remained there. It's called Iraq el-Menashia and Kisfalujah. Nowadays it's Kiryat Gat. And IDF tried to conquer these places. There were hundreds of casualties, and in one of these combats, so they sent this religious company of Alexandroni with these two cooks. By the way, one of them was killed. So after everything that happened to him, he was killed there. And so 87 men were killed at that action alone. Just think about it. 87 people were killed. It was a blunder. The commanders were of a very low quality. I mean, if I am allowed to say, very low quality. Even when it was clear that the combat is failure, they didn't went back to regroup. They just continued, and people just fell basically for nothing. And also they were not able to collect the bodies, so the body just remained there. So Rav Goren went and he met a young colonel who was called Natzer. Later, obviously, became the president of Egypt. But back then, he was just a young colonel. And Rav Goren was able, during the war, as an intermediate agreement, that the Egyptians would allow Israel to go in and to collect the bodies. So they were able to retrieve almost all of the bodies. And also he took testimonies from the Egyptian soldiers, and he was able to confirm the death of all of the soldiers that were fighting there. Gush Etzion, obviously, who fell the day of the declaration of the state, as you know. So they were conquered by the local Arabs and the Jordanian army, and 162 people were slaughtered there after surrendering. And the only I think that there was one woman that they didn't murder, and I think another 2 soldiers. And that was all from hundreds of people, 162 people. So there again, Rav Goren went there, and he was able to come to some agreement with the Georgians that were there. He bribed them. Again, a long story. And he was able to retrieve almost all of the bodies from there and to confirm the death of those that he didn't. And in many other places, he jumped in minefields. I mean, these are, I think I sent you last week, the link to his autobiography. You just read the stories there. It's amazing. It's unbelievable. He also allowed to, in a case of even on Shabbat, if you have to go to a mission and retrieve the body of a foreign soldier, you are allowed to do so even on Shabbat because he saw it as a moral boost. If you are able to bring back, and it's if you do not bring back bodies, then people feel that you leave them, abandon them in the field. And it's very important for the soldier to know that even if chas v'chayila he would be killed, still he would be taken care of. And he said because of that you are even allowed to do so on Shabbat. By the way, he mentions that in Sefer Hashmonaim, they didn't, on Shabbat they waited. It says explicitly that when Shabbat came, they did not extract bodies from the field. They waited to Motzei Shabbat. But he said it seems that in our own times, soldiers seems to be more sensitive about that, so we must do that even on Shabbat. A very interesting psika of Goren. In the end, he was able to confirm the death of all of the Halalim of Milchemet Ha'atzmaut. There was no even one woman that remained that remained chained, aguna, and as I understand it, he didn't make even one mistake, which is pity. I think it's siyata dishmaya. There was not even one mistake. There was not even one case in which he allowed the woman, and after that, it was discovered that the husband is still alive.
What period of time did it take to figure it?
About a year.
So fast. It's really fast. Like, how was he?
Yeah, it was the time was very important because as time passes, then the bodies obviously decay and decompose. So you must, if you want to be able to identify, you must act very, very quickly. So he finished that about a year after the end of the war, and again it was very dangerous. He went into basically beyond enemy lines in order to retrieve the bodies. So that is something that he saw as his work, and to this day, all of the taking care of dead soldiers is one of the major roles of the Rabbanut Tzva'it. I have friends that were on Rabbanut Tzva'it, and they trained them for all of these missions, and people thought that they would never need really to do this. It's like something that is, last time it was acted upon was on Milchemet Yom Kippur, more or less, and then unfortunately, on the 7th of October, I don't have to read the stories. I think everyone knows the stories. So the Rabbanut Tzva'it, what they did there, I think, was the most difficult work that was done in all of the war. I'm sure that I would agree to be twice time in Gaza in a tank and not work in the Rabbanut in identifying the bodies. It's holy work, and I think they need to get all of the recognition that we can get, that you can give them, and the kavod. And Rav Goren was a major proponent of the importance of this work. So that's the second thing. So we spoke about Yamim Tovim, we spoke about Agunot, and the third
solution other than going into the enemy.
If you are able to get the testimony.
Can't you do a get that if something happens, then...
I spoke about that, but there were two problems. So they were not, the people didn't want to sign the gets. Didn't work.
No, but you said that the problem is that it comes back and then he needs to write.
That was the first problem.
I'm asking, isn't it like there is no such a thing to write if something happens, then, and then...
Yeah, there is. It's halachically problematic. So some would allow that and some would not. So you begin with a problem.
Be missing.
Yeah, so so it is problematic. And so you take into calculation this problem, and then you take into calculation the problem that half of maybe more than half, didn't want to sign it anyway. So there is no, it's still as was then. The only solution is to be able to identify the body or to get a testimony.
What? That were found in Gaza. Did they have gets? The soldiers that
90% or very high percent of the soldiers are not married. We have to remember, usually it's young people, it's young men, so usually this is not a problem. And especially on what we call, it's not peace times, but not in major wars, when you don't have a miluim, then almost all of them are unmarried. It's very rare that be someone that is married. And in time of major wars, then yes, you have miluim, and then you may have a problem. The Rabbanut here has identified some of the bodies, and many times you don't need the whole body. If you have enough blood, for example, according to halacha, if you have enough blood to know that the person must be dead, then you are able to allow his wife to marry. It's not necessarily a question of time. Time may not be enough. So, for example, the wife of Ron Arad, they were not able, as to best of my knowledge, I'm not an expert, but they were not, the wife of Ron Arad, who gone missing on on Lebanon, I don't think they were able to allow his wife, and I think she's dead.
Yeah, I'm saying still today they couldn't find a proof that he's not alive.
Yeah, that he's not alive. Okay, the third topic that he was dealing with was kashrut. And again, at time of war, there is, according to the Rambam, there is a very wide hater in time of war, leniency to be allowed to eat even non-kosher foods for the soldiers that are beyond the enemy, that are in the combat zone. However, some of the poskim disagree. They don't think that such if there is a pikuach nefesh, there is a pikuach nefesh. But as long as you didn't reach a situation of pikuach nefesh, according to many other poskim, you are not allowed to eat non-kosher food during war. Rav Goren himself allowed it once. On Milchemet Shichrur, in Yerushalayim, there was a siege. There was a great hunger. And there were conserves. It was called Billy beef. It was called, it was from the British Army. So it was some type of a food, of a meat, in קופסאות שימורים. In preserved, yes. And of
talks about how his grandfather, it was like the only thing they had to eat.
Yeah, no, it was not known as very tasty, and but it was also completely non-kosher. And Rav Goren allowed the sick at the hospitals to eat from them. He said the cheshbon was that you would give the sick persons to eat the taref because they're sick anyhow, and the healthy soldiers would be able still to eat kosher food. Again, he learned it from the Hashmonaim. He said, I am sure that the Hashmonaim only got, he said, he proves it from the Hashmonaim books. He said they were able to get the siyata dishmai, the help from heaven, because they were strict about kashrut. So how would we eat when we are fighting also a few against the many? We do not need only our physical strength, we also need siyata dishmaya, and for that we need to be as strict as we can under circumstances. So the sick people may eat, and the old, they may eat the non-kosher food, but to the healthy soldiers, you still need to give them kosher food. On Pesach, he broke. They had matzot, but the matzot were held in some factory, and he said no. The soldiers of the IDF would have matzos, and he broke into the storage of the factory in order to deliver the matzot to the soldiers. And this is, you begin to hear the Rav Goren that would later be known. He was extremely known as a takif. I don't know even how to say it in English. He was very insisting on his mind, very strong. He had a very strong character. And when he decided something, he would go for it. Also, because he had this close connection with Ben Gurion, I think there is a cat entering and there is food there, so maybe we want to put it out. Okay, so because he was so close, yeah, he was a soldier, he was a fighter, but also he had even more than that. He has a very strong mind, and because Ben Gurion was very interested that he would succeed in having one army, he had an open line to Ben Gurion. And every time things didn't go as he wanted, he would call Ben Gurion, and it would be like almost a ceremony. He would say to Ben Gurion, if that is not being fixed, I'm leaving. And Ben Gurion would say, no, stay, and I would fix that. And back then, word of Ben Gurion was like the word of God. So if Ben Gurion would give an order, it would be fulfilled. And in different cases, Rav Goren threw people. He got to the level of aluf, of a general. So he sat in the matkal. Nowadays, the Rab Tzvai is a tat-aluf on purpose. They decreased his dargot because they didn't want people like Rav Goren doing balagan. But so Rav Goren would go around and he would throw people into jail, and he would come and some, even a mefaked with a high mefaked, right? A high level commander, but he's not a general. So he would come in, and there would be some problem in the kitchen, and he would throw the commander of the whole base into jail for 2 days, just in order to make his point clear. And obviously, he bought some friends, and he also bought some enemies in that way. He had with Moshe Dayan was at one of the points was the Ramatkal. And he was extremely known and famous and liked by the people. I speak before Yom Kippur, of course. And he was one of the most likable people I think in all of Israel at certain points, Moshe Dayan. He was considered the tzabar, the typical tzabar, the warrior, the man who brought victory. And Moshe Dayan wanted a seder klali for Tzahal to be done in some place in the south. And he came on Erev Pesach with a whole shayara, a whole long of cars, and he bought a woman singer, a French singer, with all of her instruments. And Rav Goren went there with a masok. My English is with a helicopter. In order to be able to go there before the Pesach, he went there with a helicopter, and he stopped Moshe Dayan from arranging the seder, and they fought. This is the Ramatkal. They fought Rav Goren and Moshe Dayan. The agreement in the end was that the Leil Seder in the basis would be a religious Leil Seder according to the Pekudot, according to the Matkal, according to the orders. These are the general orders of the army, that you must keep religious activities religious. So the Seder in the basis was a religious Seder. Moshe Dayan went to a Giv'ah, right, to some hill nearby to make his own Seder with the woman singer and the instruments. However, something went wrong, and the singer voice was dead. And she was not able to sing. So they all returned to join Rav Goren's Seder, and everyone looked at Rav Goren as a miracle doer. It was a very nice story. And that's only one story. There were many other stories. Almost all of the Pekudot Matkal, the general orders about that religion in the army, were written by Rav Goren and are being used with small corrections, but are being used to this day. So again, he really shaped the way. He was the one responsible that the kitchens in all of the army would be kosher. Now it may be that sometimes it's more kosher, sometimes it's less. Obviously, everything must be checked. However, he was very adamant about it and very, very strong. Once Arik Sharon established the Tzanchanim, the paratroopers, in the beginning it was called 101, and Rav Goren, as part of the Matkal, went to see the new unit. And they were all of them were very professional, very good looking. And someone mentioned they look like angels with these parachuting, right? The white parachuting, parachute. But however, they are angels, but they eat treif. So Rav Goren asked what's going on. They told him, there is no one religious in the company, so why should we keep kosher? So Rav Goren said, if there would be one religious paratrooper, you would keep kosher. Arik Sharon said yes. The next day, Rav Goren registered himself to a parachuting course. And on the next time there was a parachuting course, Rav Goren was not a young man anymore, so he parachuted from a plane. And again, in the book, he tells that he parachuted, you must, in order to complete the course and get the certification, that they go with this kanfei tznicha, the wings. So in order to get the wings, you need to jump, I think, twice day jumps and one night jumps. So he tried to get out of the night jump. He said, I closed my eyes during the day jumps, except for the night jumps. It's not enough. I guess 50.
Rav Goren, one of the generals that went to the coast.
Yes, that's a big story in his life. So that's my next station. So
the picture of.
So in the minute it would be there. So he jumped from the plane also at night. He got the wings, and then he walked to Arik Sharon. He told him, now you have a dati parachuter, and you must keep kosher the kitchen. According to the story, again, Arik Sharon accepted and koshered the whole kitchen of the Tzanchanim. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, we have in Tzanchanim, we have many religious guys, and the place is completely kosher. Okay, so that's just some of the stories in the Rabbanut Tzva'it. 1956, מבצע סיני, קדש. Israel conquers חצי האי סיני, the Sinai Peninsula, and Rav Goren goes, of course, to Har Sinai. He goes to Har Sinai, and with a shofar, blows the shofar on Har Sinai. He makes a decision to write a Sefer Torah on Har Sinai. That's the place to write a Sefer Torah. However, a few weeks later, they force the US and Russia together force Israel to give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. That is 1956. I skip a few years where we have to run now. So a few years later, 1967. And of course, 6 Days War. Rav Goren knows about the war before it begins because he sits in the Matkal. So he has information, inside information. He writes a drasha, a special sermon in order to be transmitted in Kol Israel in the minute that the war would break. So his sermon is the first thing to be said over the radio as the war in Kol Israel, as the war breaks. So again, you see, he's a very knowledgeable man, very able, and he in the beginning he goes to the southern border. He stays there, but when he understands that the tzanchanim with Motagur are being sent to Yerushalayim, he immediately goes to Yerushalayim. If you remember from last week, he had this special connection with the Har HaBayit and with the Kotel HaMa'aravi. So he goes there, and in the beginning, Motagur sits in Rockefeller Museum, just beneath the old city walls, and he didn't get yet the order to conquer the old city. Rav Goren sits with him, they are friends from the Matkal, and Rav Goren tries to convince him to go and conquer the city without an order. For 2 hours, he sits with him and tries, and Motagur says, I'm a soldier. And Rav Goren says to him, Jewish history would never forgive you if you would not conquer now the old city, and says, if you would have to go to the jail, I would go to jail with you. That didn't convince Motagur. However, a few hours later, Motagur receives an order, go and conquer the old city. Rav Goren goes with them into the old city, and there is a beautiful description in the book, in the autobiography that he wrote, and also we have testimonies. He runs in the middle of the street with a Sefer Torah on one hand and blowing a shofar on the other. The soldiers are going out of their mind because he's just running without any consideration. But he was in a world of his own. He was in a Geula. He was in a Yeshua. So he was running there in the middle of the street, and they shout to him, Rav Goren, you must stick to the side. You know, this is A-B of soldiering. You don't go in the middle of the street. You are trying to hide yourself. And he said, I am the highest level officer here. No one will tell me what to do. That's what he answered to them. And he continues to run with his shofar. Baruch Hashem, he got unharmed. And he go to the Har HaBayit, and he gives there a sermon that he prepared to the soldiers the night before, because he understood that they are going to conquer the old city. And you have it in source Dalet. If you'd turn to the other side of the page, these are beautiful words. It says to them, Chayalei Israel Ahuvei Aham, soldiers of Israel, loved by the whole people, Aturei Hagvura v'Hanitzachon, you are crowned with victory and heroism. Hashem imachem giborei החייל, God is with you, the soldiers. מדבר אני לכם מרחבת הכותל המערבי, שריד בית מקדשנו, so I'm speaking from the kotel, the remnant of our בית המקדש, נחמו נחמו עמי, יאמר השם אלוקיכם. So God says now that we can נחמו, right? We can be reconciled, we can comforted. זה היום קיווינו לו נגילה, וזה from the Hallel. זה היום קיווינו לו נגילה, and this is the day that we hoped for. That now we can be happy with the salvation. חזון כל הדורות, the vision of all of generations, נתגשם לעינינו, is now being realized. עיר האלוהים, מקום המקדש, the city of God, the place of the temple, הר הבית, temple mount, הכותל המערבי, the western wall, סמל הגאולה המשיחית של העם, the icon of the salvation of the people, נגאלו היום, were redeemed, liberated by you today, גיבורי צבא הגד, the heroes of the IDF. לב מי לא ירנן ולא יצא לשמוע בשורת גאולים זו. Who would not be happy to hear such a בשורה? מעתה פתוחים שערי ציון בירושלים העתיקה. And he continues. It's a beautiful short sermon that you can read later yourself. And he tells, and I'm sure it's correct, that the soldiers there were crying. And we all are familiar, I think, with the famous pictures of the paratroopers crying in the Kotel HaMaaravi. You wanted to tell a story, maybe?
No, I know that my family from Afula was with him in the
Running into the old city.
old city. We have pictures of the convoy entering the old city.
So
Goren standing in the front.
Exactly. He's standing in the front. Exactly. And he was running the show. He was completely running the show. You remember that he was married to the daughter of the Rav Nazir, of David Cohen. Now, Rav Nazir made a vow that he would not get out of his house until they liberate the Har HaBayit. So he himself went to take his father-in-law to bring him to the Kotel. And on the way, he also took Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook and brought the two of them to the Kotel when still there were only soldiers, they were still shooting there. He brought the two of them to the Kotel. That was obviously the greatest day of his life. If you also look at his autobiography, this day is getting a very large number of pages out of proportion of the rest of the book. The next day, he thought, I need to continue to Hebron in order to go to Me'arat HaMachpelah. Now, this time, he didn't even spend time convincing the local commander that he needed to conquer Hebron. He just himself went with his jeep and with his driver. They went into Hebron. The whole of Hebron was white flags. So he was the person to conquer himself, alone, by himself, to conquer the whole of Hebron. So it's an amazing story. He went to the mayor, to the Arab mayor. Later they became friends. And he dedicated to him, dictated to him what the surrender writing should be. That it's without any conditions, and he would from now on obey to any commands given by the IDF and the Jewish people. And he made the mayor there sign, they made a picture. And and then he went to Me'arat HaMachpelah, and again he turned the whole thing upside down because it was a mask. He turned the whole thing upside down in order to create what we know today. You know that before 67, Jews were only allowed to go up to the 7th step before the Me'arat HaMachpelah. They were not even allowed inside. But now, of course, he made a whole praying house or Beit Knesset inside Me'arat HaMachpelah. However, the greatest sorrow of his life was that while he was doing all of that, Moshe Dayan took the keys to the Har HaBayit and gave them to the Waqf. Because Moshe Dayan said, why do we need this Vatican? That was his sentence. Why do we need this Vatican for? It would only create wars with the Arabs, with the Muslim world. We need to give it back. So when he was dealing with Me'arat HaMachpelah, Moshe Dayan gave the Har HaBayit to the Waqf, which in a step that we eat its fruits, we can say to this day. Rav Goren is very, very, very bitter about that. He blames himself for not staying there and protecting Har HaBayit, but when he came back, it was already a done deal. There was he was not able to go back on that. So that is 67, again, the greatest days of his life. No question about that. 1970, he stepped down from being the Rav Rashi of Tzahal. He became the Rav Rashi of Tel Aviv, together with Rav Ovadia Yosef, who was also the Rav Sfaradi Rashi of Tel Aviv. And they were cooperating. It was a very good time for both of them there. And then at 1972, he became the Rav Rashi of the whole of Medinat Israel, again together with Rav Ovadia Yosef. This time, things didn't go as he planned, as he wished. And that's something that happens many times. People that come from the army, with the orientation of the army, they would give commands and the other would follow. It doesn't work so well in the civil society. You give orders and suddenly people don't follow them, and people can't be behind you and be behind your back. And he came in, and there was a certain case, it was called Hachim Langer, the Langer siblings. It was a brother and a sister that their mother was married to a non-Jew, was converted, made Aliyah, but here continued to go to a church every Sunday. And then the mother left this guy, and she married a Jew, and the two brothers were born from the second husband. Now, the mother did not get a get from the first one. So they were declared mamzeirim by the Rabbanut Rashit, because the first one was converted, so the first marriage were valid, and there was no get, so the children from a second husband are mamzeirim, bastards. And so they are not allowed to marry, and it was a big scandal. They were recruited to the army, and the friends of Goren from the army put pressure on him as the Rav Rashi Israel to allow them somehow to get married. And he decided, after doing a lot of research, he decided that the first conversion is unvalid because the man remained a Christian. He continued to go to church every Sunday. So he declared the first conversion to be unlawful, unvalid. And so there is no marriage with the first husband. There is no marriage with the first husband. There was only the marriage with the second husband. This psak was in the army. If you would give it in the army as the Rav Rashi of Tzahal, no one maybe would argue with him. But he was not in the army anymore. And in the Rabbanut Rashit, many Rabbanim did not agree with him. Rav Ovadia Yosef did not agree with him. He thought that he's allowing mamzerim to get married. The whole of the Haredi world stepped away. Rav Eliashiv, who was still in the Rabbanut up till this point, decided that he cannot continue in the Rabbanut because the way that they are going is a reform way. And so he also stepped down from the Rabbanut. There was a great split. And Rav Goren was not able to reconcile up to his last day with the Haredim and Rav Ovadia Yosef. They were somehow able to work together, but again, this was a great damage. And as I said, Rav Goren was extremely independent in his mind and very strong, and he would not go back. And maybe he didn't need to go back. I am not an expert in the details of the specific case. But it was the way that it was done was in a very army style way, and that was not the way to work in the Rabbanut. In the Rabbanut, you first need to convince people before you publish the psak, and not publish the psak and then hope that you're able to convince them. So that was I think we may say it was a mistake, and I find it very interesting. I think a very similar thing happened to the Hashmonaim. The Hashmonaim came as liberating, as army people, and they were extremely successful as army people. But when they needed to manage a kingdom later, it fell down. It fell apart. It fell apart. Why? Because they thought they need to be the Kohen Gadol and the king and the managers of the army. So they tried to take all of the powers, all of the authority to themselves, as a good commander in army should do, but not a good president or a good prime minister. And that in the end, that caused their failure because it concluded with a civil war. Now here, Baruch Hashem, there was no civil war, but there was such a rift that made the continuation of his work impossible. And so in the pages, in the very few pages in his autobiography that are dedicated to his time as Rav Rashi, there is more written about Milchemet Yom Kippur when he just, as a Rav Rashi, returned to Tzahal to work as a Rav of Tzahal. There is more that is dedicated in the autobiography than to his time, real time, as a Rav Rashi. And that is because he was able to do very little as a Rav Rashi, because of these frictions, which is unfortunate. In 1983, it was decided that the Rabbanut Rashit would be numbered. So meaning you can only serve as a Rav Rashi for 10 years. That part of that was because of their inability, his and Rav Ovadia Yosef inability to work together. So that put almost a shituk, freezing on the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut Rashit was not able to work. There was no other choice. They appointed new Rabbanim Rashiyim. He was very bitter because he thought that if I am being appointed as Rav Rashi, I need to serve as Rav Rashi as long as I can. From when do you take rabbis down? So he was very bitter about that as well. He became a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Hidra, but he didn't really teach students. It's very difficult to point at someone that says he is a Talmid Muvak of Rav Goren. He wrote books, a lot of books, but he didn't have students. He also was very bitter at nearing the end of his life because of Heskemei Oslo. and the beginning of this idea of שטחים תמורת שלום. He was a man of Eretz Israel, and he felt that he had personal, almost I would say, investment in the liberation of Eretz Israel. So when he saw that areas of Eretz Israel are being given over, it was extreme. Just on the personal level, it was extremely difficult for him. And as a man that always was in favor of mamlachtiyut, I'm speaking about the importance of United States and United Nation, suddenly came out with a psak halacha that the religious soldiers should refuse in order to evacuate the areas of Eretz Israel, which I don't know how many soldiers in fact has followed. I don't think that at that point he had so much of fellowship, but for him personally, I think it was a great disappointment. Yeah, with almost the project of his life. So that was again, that was somewhat of the ending was somewhat bitter, and I think here I am obviously impacted by us being on Hanukkah, but that's very similar to what we see with the Hashmonaim. The potential at the beginning seems very promising, but the difficulties of the transmission from the establishing and from warriors and from combats into managing normal life, it is more difficult than what we sometimes, I think, estimate. And for him, the whole transformation just didn't work. Didn't work. In 1994, he passes away. He gets a very beautiful hesped from Rav Ovadia Yosef, who, after all, comes to the Levaya and would later come every year to the Azkara. At least he thought that he needs to pay disrespect to Rav Goren. And I think many missions, Rav Goren did many important things, especially, as I said, in the army. But the act of keeping what he built is still a mission that we need keeping, and building upon it is still a mission that is for us to continue. And that's the legacy, I think, that he leaves behind him. Thank you for coming on Hanukkah, and Bezrat Hashem would continue with a new rabbi next week.